This is a recording of the DDEX webinar on the Electronic Release Notification Standard, ERN.
My name is Mark Isherwood, and I lead the Secretariat for DDEX, and I will provide a general overview of DDEX, which is relatively short. And then my colleague Niels Romp, will provide a fairly detailed explanation of the ERN standards and its choreography. And you are encouraged to ask questions, but as the slide says later on, it would be, in fact, that slide. We would prefer that if you could do that on the chat. Obviously, whilst I'm talking, Niels is watching the chat and vice versa. And we will do our very best to answer them. So I also probably ought to let you all know that to a certain extent you are our guinea pigs for these webinars. This is our first series of webinars that DDEX has done, and this call is the very first of those of that series. We obviously hope that you will find it informative, but obviously would appreciate if you are gentle with us as we are experimenting with this to a certain extent as much as you are. The key thing, though, is we do want your feedback on the webinars, and we will be sending out a very short slide deck. A short questionnaire, just to try and gauge your views about what we're doing and whether the things we could do better. So, as I said, if you have questions as we go along, we will monitor the chat and seek to answer those as we go along, or at the worst, we will try and wrap them all up at the end. So, the approach that DDEX takes with regards to its standards is a fairly holistic one. If you are going to efficiently communicate data up and down the digital music value chain, there is more than just the standard formats of the message to be done. Obviously, those are a key part of that, but also it's important that the parties who are exchanging the information actually know in what order the messages should be sent and received. And so some of our standards also include a choreography which indicates or shows the order in which messages should be exchanged and what responses should follow the receipt of a certain message and so on. And then the third piece is actually how do you exchange those messages? What protocols do you use? Up until relatively recently, most of the exchange of these standardized messages has been using SFTP sites, which to some extent is a little bit clunky considering we're in the 21st century. And we are now finding that there is a move from that towards more web services-based activity. So there is this move from SFTP to web services, and you will find that not just with regard to ERN, but also to most of the other standards. So, to sort of summarize that, DDEX's mission is to develop standard message formats, and that will include, as I've said, choreographies around specific business transactions, in other words, the orders in which the message transaction should take place, and also the protocols that you use to actually communicate those messages. One of the things that has engaged us more and more relates to the improvement of identification of entities, be that individuals or sound recordings or releases. And to do that, we work very closely with other standards organizations, particularly in the music industry, and obviously those involved with the standards like ISRC and ISWC. We do have a brief that if we feel it's necessary where no identification system exists, we will develop those ourselves. And the last thing, which is a very general thing, improve metadata quality and consistency. Again, that isn't something that DDEX on its own can particularly do, but what we do try and do is to talk about and document best practice, and try and enable a gradual improvement in the quality of data. So I think, as probably you all know, that is the most sort of problematic issue within the industry in terms of improving efficiency and automation. So DDEX is an open, not-for-profit membership organization. We have 100 and something members at the moment from right across the value chain. So that membership represents owners and administrators of musical works. So that's publishers and musical work societies. The same applies with regard to recording rights. So obviously labels, distributors, and the societies that represent the record companies and the performers for the collection of royalties, like Sound Exchange in the US or SCPP in France. Then there's the digital music retailers. Obviously, the major retailers that you would all name are members of DDEX. We have less of the regional ones, but that's something we're trying to tackle. But also technology service providers. There's obviously quite a lot of technology companies out there that aren't right owners, obviously, but provide technology services to the rights owning community. And more recently, we've gained a membership from the studio environment, and that's primarily because of the standard we introduced about 4 years ago called the Recording Information Notification standard, which was intended to be used in the context of capturing metadata in the studio. And there is a separate webinar on that standard later in the year. So as I've indicated, DDEX is a membership organization. The bulk of our members fall into the full member category, and that gives them the benefit of attending all the working group meetings, all of our plenary meetings and annual meetings. They may nominate people to stand as chairs of working groups, and they will see what we call a committee draft of every publication. That's the sort of penultimate step, internal step within DDEX, where we've got a standard to a point where everybody is happy, and then that becomes a formal committee draft, and there's a formal process thereafter which leads eventually to the publication of a standard. And you can see there that our fees are revenue-based per annum fees. And obviously, anybody who is on the call who is not a member, we would very much encourage you to seriously consider becoming one, because that means you're then part of the conversation for the development of the standards and broader developments within the digital music value chain, certainly as far as operational issues are concerned. The other membership tiers are charter members. They are basically, they get the same benefits as the full members, and their representatives from the full members provide the core of the people that are involved in DDEX's work. However, in addition to that, charter members get to nominate a board member, and for that they pay a fee of £27,000 35 per annum. We then have another group called associate members. These don't actually participate in the work. They have access to the documents, and like everybody, they're able to comment on the committee drafts before we publish the final versions to the public. There are circumstances under which associate members can join the plenary meetings for an additional fee, but under very limited circumstances. Most of our associate members are those who perhaps don't have the bandwidth to get fully involved in DDEX, or are geographically a long way from where most of our work goes at the moment, which is North America and Europe, although we're looking to change that this year. And they pay a fee of $2,675 per annum, which is purposefully put higher than the first two membership layers to encourage small companies to participate in DDEX. And indeed, of the 120 odd members we now have, nearly a third of them fall into the revenue bands of under 5 million. So we have a lot of startups involved. It's not just about the obvious big boys that you would expect, like Apple and Universal Music Group. And everybody very much has an equal voice. If you want to look at the full list, that's available on the website. Just so you know, the charter members follow the original grouping of musical work rights owners, recording rights owners, and DSPs and technology companies. And on the musical works front, that's mainly the Musical Work Rights Society, ASCAP, BMI, GAMA, PRS, SASM, and SOCAN, and Cobalt Music Publishing. On the recording rights side, we obviously have the three major labels, as you would expect, who are joined by three producer performer societies in PPL from the UK, SEPP in France, and Sound Exchange in the US. And then finally, the retailer technology service provider group has most of the household names you would expect: Amazon, Google, Spotify, Apple, Pandora, and Tencent Music from China. There are currently 2 vacancies on the board in the recording rights sector and the retailers and technology service providers. The other relationships that DDEX has is with its licensees. When you download or read the standards texts, there is an evaluation license in there. The more important one is when you then move to implementation of the license, you need to take out an implementation license, which is free, and that will authorize you to use the DDEX standard in your implementation. And as part of that, you will be allocated a DDEX party identifier. And the purpose of that is that every message you send or receive should have both the sender and receiver's DPID in the message as a means of identification. And clearly, when we move much more to web services, the need for that kind of identification is going to become more important. And we do very much encourage people to provide feedback on the standards once they're licensees. And the last group, which is becoming quite a significant group of companies, are what we call liaison organizations. These tend to be trade associations and standards bodies, and they get similar benefits to full membership without necessarily paying a fee. And what this does, is enable them to sort of pass on information to their membership, which may not all have been or be prepared to be actually members of DDEX as well. And the way in which we work, I've already kind of hinted at. If a new work item comes up, a working group is formed or it's allocated to an existing working group. And by and large, these days, most of our working groups are fairly, they're fairly standard. They're standing working groups in that they're constantly there. Those working groups will set requirements for a particular piece of work, and the Secretariat then goes away and then actually proposes a solution that meets those requirements, and then we go through an iterative process of development. And the work is done either by telephone conference or and sharing documents online, and obviously some of that's done face-to-face when we have our plenary meetings. So we have 2 of those per year. One of those is usually so we rotate it between the East Coast of North America, West Coast of North America, and Europe. We are looking this year to hold an event in Asia Pacific around October time, and we are planning that at the moment. Obviously, those plans may get scuppered by the coronavirus, but we will continue to keep planning in order to hope that can go ahead. And the plenary meetings review the work that the working groups have done. They also spend some time working intensively on their own agenda and make recommendations to the board for new work items going forward. Other physical meetings that we have will tend to be either regional or topical meetings. So one working group on occasions may build up a very large agenda of work, and it's actually necessary to have a couple of days in a meeting room together to actually seek to resolve that agenda, rather than trying to do several conference calls, which obviously takes up more time. The key thing about all of this is that DDEX works by consensus. And I mean, if possible, we aim for unanimity, but that is not always possible. But consensus essentially means a lack of sustained opposition, and it means that it's a very positive and helpful environment in which DDEX works. So the current focus areas in terms of the standards that we have, or the families of standards that we have, all of which are going to be represented by this webinar series. Obviously, release delivery, the media enrichment and description, which we'll show in a moment, sales and usage reporting, claim detail message, which is a claim message which usually is a response to a sales and usage report, works notification and licensing, that's primarily focused on the mechanical licensing process in the US, a set of messages to help support that. What we call the music licensing companies communication, those are the sound exchanges, PPLs, SCPP, GVLs of this world, not to be mixed up with the US Mechanical Licensing Collective. And unfortunately, they grabbed that acronym into law, so we're actually looking at changing the name of that to avoid confusion going forward. We also have a standard which allows parties to communicate links between works and sound recordings. As you know, linking works and sound recordings is a key part of a lot of processing within the industry, and this was devised as a mechanism to help people communicate those links. There's nothing about authority, but it is there to help communicate those links. And then finally, as I've already mentioned, Collecting Studio metadata is the RIN standard, Recording Information Notification Standard, and that will be the subject of a second of a seminar, a webinar going forward. And the way this all fits together is as per this map. So you can see all of the key players in the industry, and each of the lines represents a specific type of communication. And you can see that where we're focusing today is on the orange line, the release delivery data, and the communication of actually the resource binaries. Primarily, as far as this is concerned, we're really only looking at the communication between the record company distributor and DSP. The studio and archive stuff is really much more RIN focused, but that's the focus of this webinar. And finally, before Niels starts to talk about standards themselves, the thing more than anything that underpins DDEX standards is its data dictionary. Some people have actually compared it to a language, and it is a sort of translation language in so much as Company A has its own data model, which it then has to map to DDEX, and they are sending messages to Company B, who then maps DDEX to their data model, and that's a mechanism by which the two people can communicate, even where their data models are different. So the data dictionary contains all of the semantics and all of the terms that appear in the dictionary, in the messages, and a full structure of all of the common composites, like how we describe a party or a sound recording. You will find all of those things in there. And I think it is worth saying that, DDEX is now pretty ubiquitous. We've issued over 5,500 implementation licenses. Sadly, DDEX itself doesn't have very much data on the implementations that are going on, but we know that there isn't really a serious company operating in this space who's not using DDEX in some way or another. So that's an introduction to DDEX. I'll now hand over to Niels, who will actually talk about the release delivery standard itself. Are there any questions?
At the moment, the only questions on the chat are how to hear the audio. There seem to be some problems on some phone numbers, but otherwise, and if you have any continued questions on what Mark has said, please do still ask those questions. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Let's talk about the release delivery standards itself, or the Electronic Release Notification Message Suite Standard, ERN. Mark talked a little bit about the choreography that we're implementing, or that we are developing for each of the standard. And the choreography for the release delivery is really, really simple. There's a record company or an aggregator that operates for a record company, and they wish to make available their content through an online retailer, through a DSP. And what do they need to do? Well, they need to communicate the releases, the stuff that they want to have distributed, as well as the deals, the terms and conditions under which something is to be made available. And these can simply be communicated with a new release message from a record company or aggregator to a DSP. You can use exactly the same message to send takedowns if, for whatever reason, either because of a legal dispute or because you simply do not want any specific deal to be active anymore, use the new release message to send takedowns. You can also use the exact same message to provide just metadata to companies. You will have metadata companies that collect information, whether they're charting companies or whatever it may be. Well, the ERN message, the new release message in the ERN standard, can be used to communicate just the metadata without any deals, without any resource files themselves. Very critically, to understand how the ERN message is the concept of what we call the statement of truth. ERN messages are stateless. So that means that whenever you need to communicate something, you need to provide the complete picture of what's going on. So if you want to change, I don't know, you had a typo in the title and you want to communicate the correct title, you need to send the entire message with all the deals and everything again. So all the descriptive metadata, the deals, need to be communicated. There is no update to individual fields. It's much simpler to implement for all parties. Yes, there is more data to be exchanged, but we figured it's much simpler to have this statement of truth philosophy rather than having the ability to update individual fields. The same or similar approach is for communicating binaries. If you need to change one of the MP3 files or whatever codec you need you want to use, you need to communicate all of the binaries. Again, more data, but much simpler to implement. So how do these messages now look like? Contrary to what most of the business, online business is today, which is quite a lot of streaming, the ERN message focuses or starts by an album. So you describe an album or the equivalent of an album which can be made available. You would have identifiers, which are typically UPCs, barcodes. You'd have a title, you have artist information, you have all kinds of marketing information. And while this sounds a bit odd that we're still talking about albums, even for streaming services, most of the content is being made available in the context of such an album. If you're going to a streaming provider, you always find the albums with all the individual streaming tracks underneath it. So having an album, having this container is still the item of trade for the music industry. So you have all those albums, and you need to communicate what's in them. What are the sound recordings or videos, the images, cover image, all of the different resources that are contained in the release. Not surprisingly, you need to provide an identifier for each of those. For sound recordings, it's typically an ISRC. You need a title, you need an artist, you need all the contributor information, what did they do, and so forth. Very straightforward. But you also can make available individual sound recordings as a, if you like, product, especially for streaming. So for these, you need to have track release information. And a track release, at least in the currently most used version of ERN, contains the same information as an album release. And you would have one for each of the main resources within the ERN. And then you provide deals. So this album is available in Thailand for this and this amount of money from that period of time to that period of time, and it's also available in Australia from this amount for this amount of money from that period of time, and all of those kind of things. And you would typically also have track release deals, though you don't have to if you don't want to. And lastly, it's also important to communicate musical work information. Who are the writers? What's the title of the work? And an identifier for a work. Now, this whole format was designed in the noughties, as they're called sometimes. And the first widely used version was ERN 3. It was standardized, I would think, or published at around 2008, 2009 maybe. And it contained a lot of different business models that we actually don't see anymore. So over the years between 2002 or whatever and 2015, we realized there is so much baggage in the message that we basically needed to have a major clean out, which we did, and we created what we call ERN4, and that's the current version of the standard. It's much leaner, much meaner, much easier to understand and implement. This is how ERN4 looks. For one, we don't have actually a separate set of composites that deal with musical work information, because we actually, this is about product delivery from record companies to DSPs to online retailers. There is not that much work information that is available beyond writer information, ISWCs and so forth, and that can be communicated comfortably in the sound recording composites. And secondly, the metadata for these track releases that I talked about, well, it's basically the same as the metadata for the sound recordings themselves, and therefore we only need a very much simplified track release composite. We don't need the full richness. You don't need to repeat the title. You don't need to repeat the artist name and so forth. So that has been much simplified. And very critically, and I nearly forgot that without the slide, we actually separated out the parties, the writers and the recording artists, in a separate section of the message. This allows much better disambiguation of artists. In ERN3, typically what happened is artists would be provided just by name. But if you have a John Williams, you don't know which John Williams you are actually talking about, because it's just a name. Is it both in two sound recordings? Is it the same, or are they different? You don't know. In ERN4, there is no disambiguation, or there is no issue here, because if they are the same, they would be described together with one composite, one name, one ID, and then reference from the different sound recordings. If they are different, then they would be in different party composites. Secondly, and here is the band, the Suede, live on stage, or the London Suede. As I said, we used to have one composite containing all data that could differ between countries, and now we have different data elements that can provide language differences, script differences, as well as territory. And when I say language, it even goes into different dialects rather than just is this Mandarin or is this whatever it may be. It can be communicated in different ways. One critical thing that DDEX has battled with right from the start is the issue that the music industry, as a creative industry, is quite good at inventing new ways in which music can be made available. I briefly talked about that when I talked about the simplification of ERN4 and all the business models that never came to anything. So there are many ways to distribute music, to package music, and different types of deals. Each individual way is actually comparatively simple. So what we need to enable people to do is to just focus on those bits of the standard which needs to be able to cover all of the different ways, so that people write their implementation, which can only, or which may only need to deal with a small subsection of all of those different ways to make music available. And the way we do that is by what we call profiles. And if you could envisage the entire ERN standard as a big patchwork of or jigsaw puzzle of different opportunities, what we need to do is make sure that you only need to read those jigsaw puzzles or play with those jigsaw puzzle pieces that are actually relevant to you. And we define release profiles and life cycle profiles that describe how to provide a title, how to provide artist names, how to provide a release structure. A release structure for a classical album with musical works that are composite musical works with different parts and so forth is a completely different way to make music available than if you're having a DJ mix or a ringtone. And those kind of things need to be handled slightly different. And you have question about takedowns, redeliveries, and so forth that need to be taken into account. So those profiles is basically looking a few tiles at a time and define what those bits from this rich tapestry you actually need. Takedowns is one of those questions that comes up and again and again and again. For us, a takedown is basically the same as a label or an aggregator telling a DSP that some deal is no longer available. I used to tell you that you make this track available as a stream. I don't say that anymore. Please stop streaming this. A complete takedown is just the continuation of that. All of the deals will cease, either in one territory or in all territories. So for us, a takedown or a reduction in the deals, or in fact an addition to a deal, is handled in exactly the same way. You just send a new ERN message with those deals that are now active. And if there are no deals, well, then it means the release may no longer be made available. Has one drawback, yes. Even for a takedown, a label needs to send out the full release details. Remember, we have the statement of truth concept. But this is the by far easiest way we found to implement things. There is a second slightly strange case, yet quite real, in that over time releases in some DSPs may have become corrupted, in the sense that the metadata isn't actually the metadata anymore that has been sent by the label. This is especially critical when the catalog has actually changed since the original delivery. So now it's a new record company that has taken over a catalog of music, but they cannot send the full release details anymore because they just don't have those release details that were communicated back then in their system. And it would be silly for them to actually add that release as it used to be communicated into their system only to take it down. So there's a second message we call the purge release message, which basically is a kind of a nuclear option to take off a release from the books of a DSP with just some core metadata rather than the full description of the metadata. Typically, that will then immediately be followed by a new release message with the correctly set up product, with the correct deals as basically a switch over. How is this stuff communicated? Mark at the very beginning talked about message exchange and that we're using, or that we used, FTP, and it still is the one method that is used the most. It's ubiquitous, it's simple, it works fine. It can be done on a release-by-release basis, where basically a label sends each release plus the resource files, the MP3s, AACs, or whatever it may be, bit by bit to the DSP. The DSP takes them off the FTP server and just makes them available as such. Or you can batch them up. So there's a delivery once a day, once a week, once a month, whatever the bilateral agreement between the DSP and the record company are, and you would simply then deliver 20, 50, 100 releases in one go. And the same approach can be used by hard disk delivery. Sounds odd in 2020 that we're still talking about hard disk delivery. But if Universal wants to provide their entire catalog to a DSP, that's a lot of stuff, and it may be much cheaper to use the sneaker net, as it's sometimes called, than the internet for that. And so hard disk deliveries are still very much a thing. And DDEX for that defines the server structure, file naming convention, and those things. What this does not really do, though, is give the label or aggregator a chance to know the status of each of those deliveries or the individual releases. Yes, there is an acknowledgement message, but that's quite low level. If you need more interactivity, well, that's where we suggest to use web services. It's an asymmetric approach where the label publishes content to be delivered via an Atom feed on their own web services. Label then publishes those web services, and the DSPs, they control the engagement. They basically say, now I'd like the next release, please. Now I'd like the next release, please, and ask for it again and again, or the computer asks for it again and again, so that the stuff comes over for them to have the content. Some record companies were quite worried that they have no longer control, especially to deliver takedowns, because especially takedowns are quite often legally quite critically that something needs to be done because for legal constraints and those kind of things. But that can easily be handled through a service level agreement by basically saying, number one, the DSP must call the label's web services system at least once a day, once a week, or whatever the frequency they want to agree, or once an hour even. And secondly, the label, if there is a takedown, providing that takedown rather than other content in favor of new content, they would send takedown notices. So in the end, this is the approach that more and more record companies and DSPs are moving towards. So how does ERN look like? This is the current structure of ERN 4.2. Now, none of you will have seen this because this is currently a draft that DDEX is working on. The current version on the server that you can use, that you can implement, and that we think is perfectly good to implement. And in fact, all the major record companies, and that's not just the majors, but all the record companies and DSPs that are working on the ERN standard are in the process of transitioning from ERN 3 to ERN 4 as we speak in this quarter. So I expect quite a number of ERN 4 implementations in the next couple of weeks and months. But this is what ERN 4 looks like. For that matter, ERN 3 would look very much similar. So you have at the top blue one there, you have a message header which defines who sends the message to whom. If it's from an aggregator, the aggregator would then also send it on whose behalf. So the aggregator would say who is the rights owner, who is the record company that sends the content, when was it being sent. There is this party list that I've talked about that communicates all the writers, all the recording artists, and so forth. And there's an area that deals with cue sheets, which is especially important for videos, not so much for sound recordings. In the resource list, that's where you communicate all the details about all the sound recordings, all the images, and those kind of things. Resource list, chapter list, that's especially interesting, again, for videos, when you have different, sections within a video that you would like to call out. The release list that contains the track releases and the album releases that I've talked about, and then you have the deal list that can provide the deals, the commercial terms and conditions under which a release and therefore the resources within the release can be made available. If you're looking at what we are and what we have been working on over the last couple of weeks to make this ERN 4.2, what are the changes? The first is we've added information for session information. So what are the sessions, where and when have the sessions for a specific sound recording taking place? We support what we call classified genres, not only the freeform genres that ERN has been using since day one, but also the ability to communicate genres from a set list of genres, predefined genres. This list of genres is under constant review, but it gives a little bit more structure to the communication of genres for those who would want that. I already talked about that, have better support for dialects. So you can provide information whether it's North American English or British English used in a title, for example, or in the lyrics of a song, which also can be communicated in the ERN message. We have much better support for handling different encodings of one recording. So what happens if you have an album in a stereo encoding and you have the same in an Atmos multi-channel setup? How can that be communicated? Well, ERN 4.2 will be able to deal with that much better than what you can do already. This also then leads to better communication of relationships between releases and resources. Especially you have these different encodings for different sound recordings. They are sister, if you like, recordings. That is a relationship that is worth pointing out. And last but not least, an interesting little thing, a number of online retailers, DSPs, have a management console to which they give access to record company personnel, who then can actually look into the system and follow marketing campaigns and those kind of things outside of the normal sales reporting cycle, so that the label knows much more what's going on. But it's important to note who actually from the record company can get access to which content, to which release, to which resource. And that can be communicated in ERN 4.2. This is especially important for releases before street date. If you send an ERN to a DSP before the street date with a deal to start on the street date, you will only want to give a specific set of people within the record company access to that release, because that may even be, that new release may not be known in the entire company, but only by a handful of people. So it's quite an important thing.
So Niels, there's some questions and observations. Firstly, there are two people, Gary and Matthew, have indicated they would really like to see normalization and sort of hierarchies around genres. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Well, that's precisely what we're starting with this classified genre. The whole thing started out for us in the concept of the Mead standard, and I'll come to that in a moment, where we started to have actually a standardized genre list, and we're working on providing a more hierarchical way of presenting that. XML itself is clearly not able to describe a hierarchical genre list, but Mark talked about the data dictionary, and in there you will see hierarchical information of different things. So there you might find that bluegrass is a type of country and western music and those kind of things. So we are working towards that. I personally am still somewhat skeptical about coming up with an ultimate genre list, because genres are far too too personal and too context sensitive. I always say when you're flying on an American airliner, you get this in the in-flight entertainment. You get world music as one genre, which includes South American pan flute music and German music, which have nothing in common apart from they were not recorded in the US. So genres is always a very, very touchy subject. But I hear you, and you're not alone, and we're working on it.
Okay, two other points. How are lyrics communicated via ERN message in the XML itself or as a separate file?
So they are separate files. You have, in this structure of the message, you have a number of resources. And one resource would be a sound file, an MP3 file, and a second resource would be, for example, a text file or a PDF file that you can then link to this sound recording, and that would then contain the lyrics. And it's handled very much like a sound recording. It's just a separate file referenced from the ERN message, delivered together with the ERN message.
So a meter is the second point you make rather than the first. It's not in the XML itself.
Correct. It's not in the XML. It's in it's a separate file.
The other thing is in 382 question, can you talk a little about how to communicate artists and contributors? What artists and contributors go where? Release versus track versus sound recording?
That is precisely one of the reasons why we created ERN4, because this wasn't very, very clear. So the first thing is the contributors, that is the person who is actually standing in front of the microphone and singing or playing the guitar, they are a contributor. The contributor is on the sound recording. Now, there are two different kinds of contributors, or three, if you like. There are the people in front of the microphone. There are what we call a resource contributor. There are the people behind the microphone, so the engineers and all of those people. They're still sound recording or resource contributors. And then there are the writers to the song, and we called them in ERN3 indirect resource contributors because they contribute to the musical work, which is then embedded in the sound recording. But in addition to the actual contributors, you have what I would call the brand, the big name in front on the front of the album cover. That's what we call a display artist. And that you can have and have to have on both the sound recording and the release, because a sound recording has a name that says, well, this album was released by, I don't know, Ed Sheeran, but there were other people that also appeared on it. If there are collaborations, you would still have the big names as contributors, as display artist names, and then all the people the wetware that actually played the instruments, they would be contributors. And then you have the same on album level. You would need to provide on release level the big name that you would find on the front. And yes, there is duplication between a track release and a sound recording, which is why we created ERN4, basically.
Okay, so there's some more coming through. There's a question here about the lyrics are owned by the publisher. I mean, that's correct. I mean, we're not... What the message isn't dealing with is any legal situations. If a label has a set of lyrics that it's passing on, it's up to them to have the rights. So we're not mixing those two things up.
And the same applies to the sound recording, of course, because there is a musical work embedded in the sound recording, and the DSP needs to make sure that they have the licenses in place to be able to distribute that, if that's what they are required in the territory.
And then Gary from Tencent, who's obviously a member, is working on song tags and genre tree and would like to work with us. So perhaps, Gary, you could email your thoughts to info@ddex.net and we can pick that up.
Absolutely. We'd be delighted. The current list, by the way, was provided by Universal and then worked on and massaged to some extent within the ERN working group. But adding to it, especially from a non-Western viewpoint, I'll bite your hands off.
Also relating to 382, would you specify where would you specify neighbouring rights information, as in featured, non-featured artists?
That would be in the. They are contributors, so the information about who contributed in the to a specific sound recording can be communicated in that composite, and you have flags in there which basically say whether something is a featured artist or whether somebody is a contracted artist. I would say though that ERN is not the message to communicate rights in the sound recordings, whether that's performers' rights or producers' rights. That would be the MLC standard. That is much more geared towards communicating who has what rights in what sound recording, in which territory, for what type of usage. So that the ERN isn't really the right standard for it.
And can you have more than one display artist?
Yes, you can. You quite often do have. We differentiate between what we call display artist name. That is just a string, and that may very well be A featuring B versus C and D. And then those A, B, C, and D would be individual display artists. And in ERN4, those display artists would be in the party list and then simply being combined together into this single string, which we call a display artist name.
And how does a DSP identify a change in audio file with the DDEX metadata? I think probably with the ERN message.
By comparing. There is no, as I said earlier, there is no difference in, or the message doesn't provide any information about what has changed. So if the ERN, if the label sends a new piece of information, new metadata, they don't need to communicate the resource files. In ERN 3.8, the absence of the sound recording, the technical details composite for each sound recording, indicates that there is no MP3 file or whatever it may be being delivered together with the metadata. If there is such a composite, then it means the file is being delivered. As I've said earlier, if you deliver one MP3, you need to deliver all of the MP3s. There is no indicator which of them has changed. So the DSP will have to run a diff to find out, or even just take the new resource files and throw the old ones away.
Is there an online generator for ERN so we can build out a test message quickly?
No, there isn't. But there is or we are in the process of making available a validator where you can create ERNs. When you have an ERN, you can run it against the validator, and it will tell you whether the file is correct or not. The reason why there isn't really a generator at this stage is because there are so many ways in which different people store the information about a release. You all have your own little database. Some have it on an Excel spreadsheet. For some it's a MySQL database. For some it's an Oracle database. And having a generator doesn't really. We would need to provide a generator for all of those different formats, and that is simply not possible for a standard setting organizations, I'm afraid.
There's a request for an ETA for the validator.
Well, we can send out a link to the validator as it stands at the moment. It was written by someone, an individual who works at Sony Music. He's hosting it at the moment on a AWS server at Sony Music, but it is fully operational. You can use it. What we want to do is take it out of the Sony Music domain, because understandably not everybody wants those things to run through Sony Music, and run it off a DDEX owned server. However, it's open source. You can look at the code, and I can promise you it's benign and doesn't do anything with your content. But still, it's inappropriate to be run on a member's machine. It's better to be run on DDEX's machines.
When can we have an updated music metadata style guide? That was actually not created by DDEX. It was done by MusicBiz in the US. There has literally, in the last couple of weeks, been a couple of conversations about it needing to be updated. But to be honest with you, it hasn't gone any further than an observation that it should be updated. One of the difficulties with these style guides is that all of the DSPs tend to take the view that the differentiator that differentiates them from each other is the work they do in presenting the data to the consumer, and so there is sometimes reluctance to go too deep into metadata style guides because they've all got their own, and obviously they are going to be different. But the point is noted, but with the caveat that isn't something that DDEX was involved in. And the question is, are there any benefits of using this validator versus existing XSD XML schema tools?
Yes, there is. I talked about the profiles earlier, and so the ERN schema is one thing that validates the message, and if you fail that, then your message is simply not valid, and you need to correct it. However, these profiles also give you additional rules to follow. So, for example, if you're talking about a classical work, hierarchical classical work, you need to have a specific setup of the resource group composite that gives you these hierarchical titles, for instance. And the schema or the validator tool that the chap at Sony has put together is actually testing, validating all those profile rules as well as just the XSD. So it goes beyond just XSD validation. We're using ISO schematron for those additional rules, and that validator also runs those schematron rules. I have to add a small health warning there. These schematron rules are not fully tested. That's one of the black spots on what we're doing. We're in the process of doing that, which is also why it is still not on the DDEX website. But that's the main benefit of that validator tool over normal XSD validation.
Okay, Niels, have you got any more slides?
I've got one more slide, and that's ERN and MEAD. MEAD is this new standard that we've published earlier, which allows MEAD stands for media enrichment and description. So that allows really rich metadata to be delivered to DSPs. Now, we see it very much initially being delivered from record companies to accompany an ERN message. And the ERN message then, the MEAD message can then provide stuff like pronunciation information, for example, and specific marketing information such as target dates for specific campaigns, marketing campaigns, focus tracks, what's current, Ed Sheeran's current focus track, for example. Those things can be communicated. And it's very much targeted, not solely, but it's targeted as intelligent speakers, those devices that are more and more used to listen to music. Now, ERN and MEAD will go together, and actually there is, and I didn't talk about that earlier, there's this supplemental document list at the bottom of ERN 4.1 and 4.2, where you can then actually attach a MEAD message or a number of MEAD messages to an ERN message. And I just wanted to highlight that to deal with that. It is certainly true that most companies are, and I'm just looking at the chat going on, that most companies are using ERN3 at the moment. It's also true that most of the DDEX members are actually upgrading to ERN4 at the moment. The main reasons being it's much more efficient than ERN3, but it also gives you the ability, for example, to attach a MEAD message to it, to provide this release admin ability to DSPs. It provides additional features regarding the handling of parties. That the party list is something that especially DSPs have cried out for quite a while. Them needing to disambiguate the different artists. It is simply not sustainable, and it does make sense for labels to lump it together only to be disaggregated again on DSP side. So there are quite some benefits on upgrading to ERN4.
And really, there's been a number of to and fro about the upgrading. As I said, to be honest with you, the members of DDEX would not have spent hours and hours and hours redefining version 4 of the ERN if they didn't seriously think they were going to implement it. So we do expect some of the bigger DSPs who are members of DDEX to move to ERN4 in the relatively near future. It will take a little bit longer for some of the smaller ones. Inevitably, that's the case, but it will do. And the point that Niels made, and there's a question about it here too, is that one of the things that all of the DSPs, certainly all the major ones, are doing is wanting to get a lot more clean data about artists and contributors, which ERN3 doesn't do terribly well. And ERN4 is designed to improve, which brings me to the question about identifying artists and contributors. Questions come up. There are standards that do that. One of them is called the IPN, but that is actually a proprietary standard that is not available to everybody. It comes out of the music licensing companies, those that look after the producers. The other one is the International Standard Name Identifier, ISNI, and this came out of the library community, but can apply just as equally to music. And the music industry is looking at this as a way of trying to uniquely identify artists amongst themselves. So that just to let you know that is something that's ongoing. Apple using DDEX. Okay. Apple had pretty much got all of its ingestion sorted with all of the labels by the time DDEX was actually formed in 2006. So unless, and it kind of comes to the point somebody made in the chat that, you know, if it's working, why do you want to change it? For the time being, Apple will continue to do their own thing. I understand that. You know, as somebody said, why change it if it's not broken? But that said, Apple are a very heavy user of DDEX as far as the DSR standards, the digital sales reports, are concerned, and very heavily involved in DDEX as a member. There may come a time when they decide to change to ERN for release information, but DDEX is not in a position to do anything to influence that. I'm afraid, you know, that's where it is, and the historical reasons for that are obvious.
By the way, there are some comments on the chat whether DSPs will go on with a testing on ERN4. They will. At least that's what all the members have said. They are very keen to get on ERN4, and so are the labels that work in the ERN working group, and they will move towards ERN 4.2 in all likelihood in the next weeks. We are at the cusp of actually, hopefully today we will be declaring what we call committee draft of ERN 4, which will then hopefully lead to the new version being published within this spring. But it will happen. I'm confident of that.
Okay, we've actually gone on rather longer than we anticipated. Are there any other questions at this stage? I'll give you a moment or two to write if anybody has any. There's a question that maybe I thought we dealt with this, but no. What display artists should be listed on the main release album level? All artists from all tracks.
That is something for the marketing department of a record company to decide. If you're looking at the physical product, if you're looking at a CD or if you're as old as I am, a vinyl, then there is a big name written on the front. That would be the main the display artist name for that release. That is typically, if it's from one artist, all the sound recordings are from one artist, maybe two of them are collaborations with others, then it would just be the name of that one artist. And if it's your best of 2019 sampler, then it would be, there might not be anything, or there would be various or something like that written in there. So that is entirely dependent on the content. DDEX has no view on what you should put in there.
Question about how the DSPs will transition. Yes, they will usually be running a version of 3 and a version of 4 at the same time. You can't switch everybody over in one go. They're obviously not going to drop people who are still on 3, so I wouldn't worry about that. In terms of the genre list, this is something we're still working on, so it hasn't actually been, it hasn't yet been published.
Well, actually, it has as part of the Mead data dictionary.
Okay.
Yoktan, if you drop me an email, I'll send you a link. Yes, there are samples available with it. If you're going to the knowledge base under the release notification, there is on the right-hand side, there's a red box which contains a link to samples. So there's a sample basically for each of the different profiles.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, and have the good what's left of your day. Thank you.